The sound of the slap cut through 500 conversations at once. Grace Whitfield's cheek burned red under the crystal chandeliers of the Calloway estate. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet stopped mid-note. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that ballroom breathed. Grace didn't cry out. She didn't raise her hand to her face. She just stood there, spine straight, eyes wet but steady, staring at the woman in the white silk gown who had just struck her in front of the entire Charleston social elite. "You clumsy, filthy woman," Vanessa Sinclair hissed, loud enough for the microphones near the band to catch every word. "Do you know how much this dress cost? Do you know who I am?" Grace opened her mouth, closed it again. She had learned, over 6 years of working in this house, that arguing with Vanessa never ended well. Then, from somewhere near the dessert table, a small voice rang out. "She didn't do it." Every head turned. A 7-year-old girl in a pale blue party dress stood on a chair, her small hand still gripping a plate of untouched cake, her chin trembling but lifted high. "I saw everything," Emma Calloway said, "and I'm not scared to tell." Richard Calloway, the man being celebrated that night for his engagement to Vanessa, felt his stomach drop. He set down his glass. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his fiancée. He looked at the woman still standing frozen with a red mark blooming across her cheek. And somewhere deep in his chest, a question he had been avoiding for months finally forced its way to the surface. What have I not been seeing? The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Nobody moved. Nobody dared touch a glass or whisper a word. 500 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the state stood frozen around a child who had just decided she would rather be brave than safe. 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Richard Calloway had built Calloway Textiles from a single warehouse in Savannah into a company worth over $2 billion. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, the kind of man magazines described as self-made, without ever asking what that self had lost along the way. He had lost his wife Diane 4 years earlier. Cancer. Fast and merciless. Emma had been 3 years old, too young to remember her mother's face without photographs, but old enough to feel the hole she left behind. After Diane died, the house on Ashworth Lane had gone quiet. Rooms that once smelled like fresh bread and lavender started smelling like polished wood and nothing else. Richard buried himself in work, the only language he trusted anymore. Board meetings stretched past midnight, business trips multiplied. He told himself it was for Emma's future, that the empire he was building would one day belong to her, that the long hours were a form of love, even if they didn't look like it. That was when Grace Whitfield came into their lives. She had been hired through an agency, a single mother from the east side of town, raising her own daughter Zoe on a maid salary after her husband walked out 2 years earlier without so much as a note. Grace was quiet, thorough, and unfailingly kind. She never asked Richard for anything beyond her wages. She never gossiped with the other staff, never lingered too long in rooms that weren't hers to be in, never overstepped the invisible lines that come with working in someone else's home. But with Emma, she was different. She sang while she braided Emma's hair in the mornings, old church hymns her own grandmother used to hum. She let Emma help her bake cookies, even when it meant twice the cleanup and flour on every surface in the kitchen. She sat with Emma during thunderstorms, when the little girl still cried out for a mother who could no longer come, and stayed until the small shaking hands finally went still. Slowly, without either of them quite noticing it, Grace became the closest thing to a mother Emma had left. Their days had a rhythm to them, small and ordinary and precious in the way ordinary things become precious when you almost lost them once already. Grace would wake Emma with the same 3 gentle knocks on her bedroom door every morning, humming under her breath as she opened the curtains. Breakfast was oatmeal with cinnamon on school days, and pancakes shaped like uneven stars on weekends, a tradition that started as an accident, Grace's spatula slipping the first time she tried to make a heart, and became a beloved ritual ever since. In the afternoons, if the weather was good, they walked the long gravel path around the estate's gardens, Emma chattering about her day, while Grace listened with the kind of full attention few adults in Emma's life had time to offer anymore. Richard noticed too. He noticed the way Emma's laughter had started coming back, bright and unguarded. He noticed how the house felt less like a museum and more like something lived in again. He was grateful, in the distracted way busy men are grateful, filing it away as one more thing he didn't have time to properly appreciate. He told himself he would find a way to thank Grace properly. Someday, when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. Then Vanessa Sinclair arrived. She came into Richard's life at a charity gala, dazzling in emerald green, laughing at his jokes like they were the funniest thing she'd ever heard. She was 38, polished, ambitious, connected to half the old families in the state, or so she said. She spoke of a family fortune lost in an ugly divorce, of rebuilding her life with dignity, of wanting nothing more than a real home again. Richard, lonely in ways he rarely admitted even to himself, found the story easy to believe. Within 6 months, she had a ring on her finger and a wedding planner on retainer. Richard told himself he was happy. He told himself Emma needed a mother figure, a real family again, something more than a father who worked too much, and a maid, however kind, was still, in the end, an employee. He told himself the uneasy feeling in his gut whenever Vanessa spoke to the staff was nothing. Stress, maybe. Nerves about the wedding. He was wrong about that last part. He just didn't know it yet. The trouble started small. The way trouble usually does. A missing bracelet, which Vanessa swore Grace had taken, until it turned up in Vanessa's own jewelry box a week later, with no apology offered, only a curt comment that Grace should be more careful with other people's things going forward. A comment about how some people shouldn't be alone with children, muttered just loud enough for Grace to hear, but not loud enough to be confronted directly, tossed off like an idle observation about the weather. A demand that Grace address her as Miss Sinclair, ma'am, at all times, though Richard had never required such formality from anyone in his home, and though Grace had spent 6 years being called simply Grace by everyone from the gardener to the CEO himself. Grace absorbed each slight the way she absorbed everything, quietly, professionally, telling herself it was temporary, that Vanessa's coldness would thaw once the wedding stress passed. She needed the job. Zoe needed braces, needed new shoes for the coming school year, needed the stability that only a steady paycheck could provide. Grace swallowed her pride and kept working. But Emma noticed things too. Children always do. She noticed that Vanessa's smile disappeared the instant her father left the room, replaced by something flatter, colder, almost bored. She noticed that Vanessa's fingers dug into her arm a little too hard when steering her through a crowd, always in places long sleeves could hide, always released the moment anyone else came near. She noticed that on the nights Vanessa put her to bed instead of Grace, sleep came harder and nightmares came easier, dreams where she was being pulled somewhere she didn't want to go, and nobody was coming to find her. Emma didn't tell her father. She had asked him once, gently, over breakfast, if Vanessa could be a little nicer, and Richard had laughed it off, ruffling her hair, telling her that adults sometimes seemed strict when they were really just nervous about new families coming together. He meant well. He simply wasn't looking closely enough, too buried in merger paperwork and quarterly reports, to see the small, careful way his daughter had started flinching at raised voices. Only Grace saw the full picture. She saw the fading bruise on Emma's wrist that the girl said came from falling on the stairs, though the stairs in question were carpeted and gently sloped, hardly the kind that left marks shaped like 4 small fingers. She saw Emma flinch when Vanessa raised her voice over something as small as a wrinkled napkin. She saw a child growing quieter, smaller, more careful with her own joy, folding herself into corners of rooms instead of filling them the way she used to. One evening, Grace found Emma sitting alone in the reading nook off the library, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. "What's wrong, sweet girl?" Grace asked, kneeling beside her. "Nothing," Emma said, too quickly. "Emma, You can tell me anything, you know that." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Vanessa says if I tell Daddy things, bad things happen to people I love. She says grown-ups don't believe little girls anyway." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the evening chill coming through the library windows. "What kind of bad things, baby?" But Emma only shook her head and pressed her face into Grace's shoulder, and Grace held her there for a long time, saying nothing, her mind already racing. That night, after Emma was finally asleep, Grace sat at the small desk in her room above the garage and pulled out a notebook. She began to write. Dates, small details. The bracelet, the comment about children, the bruise on the stairs that weren't the kind of stairs that bruised, the threat, whatever it truly meant, that had frightened Emma into silence. She told herself it was nothing, that she was overreacting, that a maid accusing her employer's fiancé of anything would end with her unemployed and unbelieved, her word against a woman with connections in every courtroom and country club in the state. But she kept writing anyway, just in case. Over the following weeks, the pattern grew harder to ignore. There was the afternoon Vanessa found Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit, a threadbare thing Diane had given her as a newborn, and declared it unsanitary and too babyish for a girl about to be part of a respectable family, tossing it into a donation box before Emma even knew it was gone. Emma cried for 2 days. Grace quietly retrieved it from the donation pile in the garage before the truck came, hid it in her own room, and gave it back to Emma at bedtime with a finger pressed to her lips. Our secret. There was the dinner where Emma spilled a glass of milk, an ordinary accident that happens in every household with small children, and Vanessa gripped her arms so hard under the table that Emma bit back a cry, her face going pale, while Richard, at the head of the table, was on a call with investors and never looked up. There was the afternoon Grace overheard, through a half-closed door, Vanessa on the phone with someone, her voice low and businesslike in a way it never was around Richard. Once the wedding happens, the trust restructures automatically. That's what the lawyer confirmed. The girl doesn't need to be underfoot for that to work in our favor. There are excellent boarding schools up north, very far north. Grace hadn't understood all of it, but she understood enough to write it down, word for word, in her notebook that night, her hands trembling as she formed the letters. Each incident on its own might have been dismissed, explained away, forgiven as the stress of blending a new family. But together, stacked one on top of another in the pages of Grace's notebook, they formed something undeniable. A pattern, a plan, a little girl being slowly, deliberately pushed out of her own life. Grace knew she was running out of time to stay silent. She just didn't yet know how to break that silence without losing everything she and Zoe depended on. The isolation came next, so gradual that Grace almost didn't notice it happening until it was nearly complete. First, Vanessa restructured the household schedule, moving Grace's hours so she was responsible for the laundry and the East Wing in the mornings, the exact hours Emma used to spend with her before school, braiding hair and eating breakfast together at the kitchen island. A new hire, a young woman named Priya, who Vanessa had personally selected, and who seemed to answer to Vanessa alone rather than to Richard, took over the mornings with Emma instead. Then came the excuse that Grace's presence at family dinners blurred appropriate boundaries, and Grace found herself eating alone in the kitchen instead at the family table, where Emma had always insisted on an extra chair beside her own. Emma fought it in the only ways a 7-year-old could. She cried when Priya braided her hair too tight and too fast, missing the gentle patience Grace always brought to the task. She refused, some mornings, to eat breakfast at all until Grace was allowed to at least say good morning to her before school. Small rebellions, quiet ones, the only kind available to a child with so little power over her own days. "I miss you," Emma whispered to Grace one evening, sneaking into the laundry room where Grace was folding towels, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one had followed. "Why doesn't she want us together anymore?" Grace pulled her into a hug, breathing in the familiar smell of the girl's shampoo, memorizing the moment the way she'd started memorizing all of them lately, uncertain how many more she'd be allowed to have. "I don't know, baby, but I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere, no matter what schedule she puts me on." It was a promise Grace intended to keep, even if she wasn't yet sure how. The isolation might have worked, might have slowly severed the bond between Grace and Emma the way Vanessa clearly intended, if not for one small victory that came in the middle of it all. Emma's school held a family day that spring, a morning of games and crafts meant for parents and guardians to attend. Richard had a board meeting he couldn't move. Vanessa declined outright, calling it beneath the kind of events she attended. So it was Grace, in her one free morning that week, who showed up in the school gymnasium, cheering louder than any parent in the room when Emma won the three-legged race, paired with her best friend from class. Emma ran straight into Grace's arms afterwards, breathless and glowing, medals still swinging from her neck. "You came! You actually came!" "Wouldn't have missed it for anything," Grace said, and meant it with her whole chest. That evening, when Richard came home late from his meeting and asked Emma how her day had gone, she talked for 20 straight minutes about the race, about Grace's cheering, about the blue ribbon now taped proudly to her bedroom wall. It was such a small thing, a school field day, a three-legged race, a torn paper ribbon. But it was the first time in weeks Richard had seen his daughter talk about anything with that much unguarded joy, and some quiet part of him filed the observation away, unaware yet of how important it would become. There was one night, only 2 weeks before the engagement party, when Grace almost said everything out loud. She had found Emma sitting on the bathroom floor at nearly midnight, knees drawn to her chest, silently crying in a way that broke something in Grace's chest to witness. Vanessa had discovered a drawing Emma made of her mother, done from an old photograph, and torn it in half in front of her, calling it morbid, and telling Emma that dwelling on a dead woman wouldn't help her adjust to the new family. Grace had gathered the torn pieces of paper from the trash, smoothed them flat on her bedroom desk, and taped them back together late into the night, so Emma would have it whole again by morning. The next day, Grace found Vanessa alone in the garden, and, against every instinct telling her to stay silent, spoke up. "Miss Sinclair, with respect, Emma is grieving her mother. Tearing up her drawings isn't going to help her heal faster. It's only going to make her feel like she has to hide who she misses." Vanessa's eyes had gone flat and cold, the pleasant socialite mask dropping away entirely for just a moment. "Watch yourself, Grace. You're staff. You clean the floors and you fold the laundry. You do not get an opinion on how I raise my future stepdaughter. One phone call from me and you're unemployed with a reference that guarantees you never work in this town again. Do you understand me?" Grace understood. She understood completely. And it terrified her, not for herself, but for what it meant Emma would face once Grace was no longer there to notice, to soften, to quietly protect. She walked away from that garden with her hand shaking and her resolve, somehow stronger than before. She began keeping a second copy of her notebook hidden in an envelope at her sister's house across town, just in case anything happened to the first. She didn't know yet that it would only take a handful more weeks before everything came apart in front of 500 witnesses. But some part of her, lying awake that night, listening to Emma's soft, even breathing finally settle into sleep, sensed that the quiet couldn't hold much longer. Something had to give. She just prayed that when it did, Emma wouldn't be the one left holding the pieces. The engagement party had been Vanessa's idea from the start. 500 guests, the Callaway ballroom transformed into something out of a magazine spread. String lights threaded through white orchids, a band flown in from New York, ice sculptures shaped like swans, slowly melting under the heat of the crowd. "This is our moment," Vanessa had told Richard, straightening his tie with a proprietary tug. "Everyone who matters will be there." Grace had spent the week helping the catering staff prepare, polishing silver until her hands ached, dressing Emma in the blue gown the girl had chosen herself, the one with tiny embroidered stars along the hem. "You look like a princess," Grace told her, tucking a curl behind her ear. "Will you be there too?" Emma asked, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. "The whole time?" "I'll be right at the edge of the room, baby, close enough to see you. I promise." That promise was the only thing that kept Emma's nerves steady as the guests began arriving, a river of gowns and tuxedos and diamonds flowing through the front doors of the Calloway mansion. The party unfolded exactly as Vanessa had planned, until it didn't. It happened near the dessert table. Grace was refilling a tray of champagne flutes when Vanessa approached, already 2 glasses deep into the evening, her voice pitched for an audience. "You spilled wine on my dress," Vanessa announced, though no tray had come anywhere near her, though the small red stain blooming across her hem had appeared, Grace would later realize, from Vanessa's own hand brushing against a nearby ice bucket moments before. "Ma'am, I didn't."
The slap came before Grace could finish the sentence. The room fell silent. Somewhere in that silence, something in Emma Calloway broke loose, some final thread of fear that had been holding her back for months. She climbed onto her chair. "She didn't do it," Emma said, her voice shaking but clear, carrying farther than a 7-year-old's voice had any right to carry. "I was standing right there. Vanessa spilled it herself. She does mean things and then blames Grace. She's done it before, lots of times." A murmur rippled through the crowd, phones beginning to rise, the first flashes catching the moment from a dozen angles. Vanessa's face went white, then red. "Emma, sweetheart, you're confused. You don't understand adult things. Come down from there." "I'm not confused." Emma's chin lifted higher. "I have a bruise on my arm from Tuesday. You grabbed me because I didn't want to wear the dress you picked. Grace put ice on it and told me not to tell Daddy because she was scared you'd fire her. But I'm not scared anymore. I want everyone to know." 500 guests stood frozen in that ballroom, watching a 7-year-old girl unravel a lie that had been holding an entire household hostage for months. Richard crossed the room in 6 long strides and lifted his daughter down from the chair, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried through the silent room like a shout. "Show me your arm." Emma pulled back her sleeve. The bruise had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but it was there, unmistakable. 4 small oval marks where fingers had gripped too hard. Something in Richard Calloway's face changed in that moment. The confident businessman, the man who negotiated $1 million deals without blinking, looked for the first time in years genuinely lost. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Explain this to me, right now." Vanessa's composure cracked, but only for a heartbeat. Then the practiced charm slid back over her face like a mask clicking into place. "Richard, darling, children exaggerate. You know how imaginative she is. I would never." "Grace," Richard turned to the maid, who still stood with a red palm print fading on her cheek. "Did you know about this?" Grace hesitated. 6 years of careful silence warred with the truth sitting heavy on her tongue, but Emma had already done the hardest part. Grace wasn't about to let the girl stand alone. "Yes, sir," Grace said. "I've been keeping a record. Dates, what I saw and heard. I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I was trying to turn you against her. I was scared no one would believe me over a woman like Miss Sinclair." "A record," Richard repeated. "In my room, sir, in a notebook. I can show you everything. There's more than the bruises, sir. I heard her on the phone once, talking about boarding schools, about trusts, about Emma not needing to be underfoot." The ballroom, which had been holding its breath, released it in a wave of whispers that swept from one end of the room to the other. Vanessa laughed, a brittle, too bright sound. "This is absurd. You're taking the word of the help over your own fiancé in front of everyone?" "I'm taking the word of my daughter," Richard said.
who has never once lied to me about anything that mattered, and I'm asking questions I should have asked months ago." He turned to the party planner hovering nearby, pale and uncertain about what to do with 500 stranded guests, the string quartet still frozen mid-piece. "Please see that everyone gets home safely. The party is over." The days that followed unraveled slowly, painfully, the way truths often do once the first thread gets pulled. Grace's notebook, handed over that same night, was more thorough than even Richard expected. Dates of bruises, times Vanessa had sent Grace out of the house on invented errands, only for Emma to come home upset and unwilling to say why. A note about a locked drawer in Vanessa's study that Emma had once glimpsed being opened, full of documents Vanessa hadn't wanted anyone to see. The overheard phone call about the trust, transcribed as closely as Grace could remember it. That locked drawer became the next piece of the puzzle. Richard, sick with guilt and unable to sleep, sat with his head of household security the following morning and asked a question he never imagined he would need to ask: whether the house's camera system, installed years earlier for insurance purposes and largely ignored since, had captured anything useful. It had. Grainy footage from the hallway camera outside Emma's room showed over a span of weeks exactly what Grace's notebook described. Vanessa gripping Emma's arm outside her bedroom door, the date stamp matching one of Grace's entries precisely. Vanessa in another clip, on the phone in the hallway, her voice too low for the camera's microphone to fully capture, but her expression unmistakably cold as she gestured toward Emma's closed door. Richard watched the footage twice, then a third time, his jaw tightening with each replay, his hands curling into fists on the desk in front of him. He called his lawyer that same afternoon and requested a full financial review of the joint accounts he had already begun setting up for the wedding. What they found turned his stomach in an entirely different way. Vanessa Sinclair was not, as she had told Richard, a woman from old Charleston money who had lost her family fortune in a bad divorce. She was, according to records his lawyer dug up within 48 hours, a woman with a trail of debt across 3 states, 2 prior engagements to wealthy men that had ended abruptly and quietly, always shortly before the wedding, and a pattern of moving small sums of money through accounts that didn't belong to her. She had already, in the 6 months of their engagement, redirected over $300,000 from a household account meant for renovations into an account under her maiden name. And Emma, it turned out, had been an obstacle from the very beginning. A child from Richard's first marriage meant a will, a trust, a legal complexity that limited exactly how much of the Calloway fortune Vanessa could eventually claim once she and Richard married. Boarding school brochures, found later in Vanessa's desk drawer, were dated from just 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, tucked beside a folder of legal correspondence about guardianship considerations for blended families, a phrase that made Richard's blood run cold when he read it. The bruises weren't calculated cruelty in the cinematic sense. They were the ugly byproduct of a woman's patience running thin around a child she saw as an inconvenience, standing between her and the life she wanted. That made it no less serious. If anything, it made Richard's fury burn colder and steadier once he understood it fully. The confrontation, when it came, happened not at a party but in the quiet of Richard's study, 3 days after the engagement fell apart in front of 500 witnesses. Vanessa arrived expecting to salvage things. She had rehearsed her apology in the car, practiced tears ready to fall at the perfect moment, a strategy that had worked on other men, in other cities, in other lives she had since left behind. "Richard, please, let me explain. I panicked that night. I never meant." "I've seen the security footage," Richard said quietly, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "I've seen the financial records. I've seen the boarding school brochures and the folder about guardianship. I've read Grace's notebook, every page. I've had a very long few days, Vanessa, and I want you to understand something clearly." He finally raised his eyes to hers. "I don't care about the money. I have more than enough to survive losing what you took. What I cannot forgive, what I will never forgive, is that you hurt my daughter, and then let an innocent woman take the blame for it, over and over, for months, while I was too distracted to notice. I never meant to hurt her badly. It was just discipline. Children need boundaries. She's 7 years old, and she was scared to tell her own father the truth. That's not discipline. That's fear you built on purpose, so she would stay quiet long enough for you to finish whatever it was you were planning. The engagement ring came off Vanessa's finger and landed on the desk with a small, final click. "The lawyers will be in touch," Richard said, "regarding the money you took, and regarding the terms under which you are required to leave this house today."
Vanessa's mask finally, fully shattered. What was left underneath wasn't remorse. It was fury at being caught, cold and unflinching. "You'll regret this, Richard. Nobody walks away from me and comes out looking good. I know people. I know things about your business that could make life very difficult for you." "Then let them try," Richard said evenly. "I have a security tape of you leaving bruises on a 7-year-old, a paper trail of stolen money, and a notebook kept by a woman with more integrity than anyone else in this house showed her for 6 years. I think I'll take my chances." She left the house that afternoon, and within the month, formal charges for financial fraud were filed, built on the paper trail Richard's lawyers had assembled, alongside a separate civil matter concerning the bruises documented on camera. 2 other men from her past, it turned out, had strikingly similar stories once word of the scandal spread through the social circles Vanessa had once ruled. A reporter from the local paper, tipped off by a guest who had recorded the ballroom scene on their phone, ran a story within days. Vanessa Sinclair's name, once spoken with envy across Charleston social circles, became a cautionary tale instead. The courtroom proceedings, when they finally came months later, were quieter than the ballroom had been, but no less final. Vanessa sat beside her lawyer in a gray suit, none of the emerald green confidence left in her posture. Richard sat 2 rows back, Grace beside him, Emma safely at home with Zoe and a trusted babysitter for the day, spared from having to see any of it in person. Vanessa's lawyer tried, in his opening statements, to paint the story as a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an overzealous household employee and an impressionable child. But the evidence didn't cooperate with that story. The prosecutor walked the judge through the financial records first. The $300,000 moved in small, careful increments designed to avoid triggering the bank's fraud alerts, a pattern the forensic accountant described as deliberate and practiced, language that made Vanessa's jaw tighten in her seat. Then came the security footage, the same grainy hallway clips Richard had watched alone in his study, now projected for a courtroom to see. And finally, Grace's notebook, entered into evidence page by page, dates lining up precisely with the footage, precisely with the bruises a pediatrician had separately documented and testified to under oath. "Miss Whitfield," the prosecutor asked Grace directly during testimony, "why did you keep this notebook instead of reporting your concerns immediately?" "Because I was scared nobody would believe me," Grace answered simply, her voice steady despite the packed courtroom. "I've learned that when you're a Black woman working in someone else's home, your word doesn't always carry the same weight as the person signing your paycheck. So I decided if my word wasn't going to be enough, I'd make sure the facts spoke for themselves instead." The judge, reviewing everything laid before her, did not take long to reach a decision. Full restitution of the stolen funds, 3 years of probation, a permanent restraining order keeping Vanessa away from the Calloway family entirely. It wasn't the dramatic justice of handcuffs and sirens, but it was real, and it was earned, and it was enough for Richard to finally exhale a breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. Outside the courthouse steps, reporters called out questions, but Richard simply took Grace's arm and guided her past the cameras without a word, the 2 of them walking together toward the car, where, waiting inside with the driver, 2 little girls sat coloring, blissfully unaware of just how much had been decided that afternoon on their behalf. For Grace, the weeks after the party felt like waiting for a second shoe to drop. She had exposed a wealthy, well-connected woman in front of 500 people. She had assumed, quietly, that her job,
maybe her entire reputation would be the price of that truth, that Richard's gratitude in the immediate aftermath would fade once the shock wore off, and the practical realities of running a household without a fiancé set in. Instead, Richard called her into his study a week after Vanessa's departure, looking more exhausted and more human than she had ever seen him. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one. You were protecting my daughter for months while I was too busy, too distracted, too unwilling to see what was happening in my own house. You risked your job, maybe more, to keep her safe. I don't know how to properly thank someone for that." Grace shook her head. "I just did what any decent person would do, sir. Emma's a sweet girl. She didn't deserve any of it." "Please," Richard said. "Call me Richard. And I'd like to talk about your position here. Not as staff. I'd like to talk about you and Zoe becoming part of this household properly, if that's something you'd want. Emma needs stability, and stability with someone she trusts, someone who has already proven what kind of person she is under pressure. I can't offer that as an employer, but I'd like to offer it as something more permanent, if you're open to it."
Grace felt tears rise, unexpected and overwhelming. 6 years of careful, guarded distance finally allowed to soften. "I'd like that," she said. "I think Emma would too." He also insisted, over her initial protests, on covering the cost of Zoe's braces, on setting up a proper college fund for both girls, not as payment for silence or as a transaction of any kind, but as a long overdue acknowledgement of everything Grace had quietly carried for years without ever asking for recognition. A year passed, the way years do, slowly in the difficult moments, and impossibly fast everywhere else. Emma started 2nd grade that fall, and for the first time since her mother died, her teacher noted on the first report card that she was a bright, confident, remarkably kind child who isn't afraid to speak up in class. Richard kept that report card in his desk drawer, taking it out sometimes on hard days, a reminder of exactly how far his daughter had come. Grace never did become Richard's wife, not in that first year, and the story never tried to force that ending on either of them before they were ready for it. What grew between them instead was slower and steadier, built on trust earned through crisis rather than a whirlwind romance performed for a crowd. They took things one honest conversation at a time, no more secrets, no more silence, and if something more eventually bloomed between them, it would grow the way real things do, without an audience of 500 people watching, and without anything left hidden in a locked drawer. Vanessa Sinclair's name occasionally surfaced in a headline somewhere, a cautionary footnote in someone else's story now instead of the center of her own. Richard stopped reading those headlines after the first few months. There was nothing left there that mattered to his family anymore. The final scene of this story didn't happen at a lavish party or in a courtroom, though there was a courtroom eventually, one that ended with Vanessa Sinclair facing real consequences for the money she'd stolen and the trust she'd broken. The final scene happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, months later, in the kitchen of the Calloway house. Emma stood on a step stool at the counter, flour dusted across her nose, carefully cracking an egg into a mixing bowl, the way Grace had taught her years ago. Zoe, now living in the house full-time with her mother, sat at the table doing homework, occasionally glancing up to laugh at something Emma said. The stuffed rabbit, rescued from a donation box months earlier, sat propped against the fruit bowl, watching the whole scene with its permanently stitched smile. Richard leaned in the doorway, watching, a mug of coffee warm in his hands. Something in his chest finally settled after years of feeling like the house was missing a piece it couldn't name. "Grace," Emma said, not looking up from her mixing bowl, "can we make the cookies again this weekend, the ones with chocolate chips?" "Only if you promise not to eat the dough raw this time," Grace said, smiling. "I promise," Emma said, in the specific tone of a child who has absolutely no intention of keeping that promise. Richard caught Grace's eye across the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, they shared the quiet, easy laughter of two people who had weathered something hard together and come out whole on the other side. The house on Ashworth Lane didn't smell like fresh bread and lavender the way it had when Diane was alive. It smelled like something new now, something rebuilt rather than replaced, a family formed not by blood or by the perfect fairy tale Richard had once imagined, but by honesty, by courage,
and by a 7-year-old girl who found the bravery to stand on a chair in front of 500 people and tell the truth, even when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with thunder and spectacle. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of a small voice, refusing to let an innocent woman take the blame for someone else's cruelty. And sometimes healing looks like flour on a little girl's nose and chocolate chip cookies on a Saturday afternoon, and a family, finally, quietly, coming home to each other.